A few winters back, I had just wrapped up my divorce about 6 months prior, and to say I needed a reset would be an understatement. My girlfriend at the time, Christina, proposed we escape to a quiet place, something to contrast the chaos I had been navigating. We discovered a rental by a lake in upstate New York, and I booked it for a week on a whim. The location was precisely what I craved, a modern yet cozy house right on the water, nestled among the woods, with only a few other properties dotting the shoreline. Most of them were vacant. It wasn't precisely the height of the season for lakeside living. I welcomed that, as my desire was to be as distant from civilization as possible. The host wouldn't be present, but he provided us with thorough instructions on locating the keys and some information about the house, just the usual Airbnb details. We arrived in the morning, and upon our arrival, a small package awaited us on the front steps. There was no return address, just a handwritten note that read, "Enjoy your stay. Make sure to stay warm." That part was rather charming. But there was something else in the package, a tiny box of matches. We assumed it was some sort of welcome gift, an unusual one, but harmless enough. Christina made a quip about how the upstate folks have always had their quirks, and that was that. The next 2 days unfolded just as we had hoped. Long hikes through the snow, hot drinks by the fireplace, and complete tranquility. Oh, I should probably mention that the snow had been steadily falling since we arrived. Not quite amidst the blizzard, the scene unfolded with a serene stillness. The wind and fog were absent, yet the snow blanketed the landscape, rendering it pristine. It felt like the perfect moment to sketch the layout of the house. The master bedroom, where we rested, occupied the second floor, featuring expansive windows opposite the bed that framed a view of the lake. The roof, or perhaps just the windows, seemed delicate, allowing the gentle patter of snowflakes to filter in, adding a delightful ambience. A skylight above invited us to gaze at the falling snow, enhancing the cozy atmosphere. As I drifted off beneath the enchanting sky and falling snow, I awoke sometime after midnight on the third night to a sound that barely pierced the howling wind and swirling snow. The first thing that struck me was the storm. The snowfall had intensified significantly since I had closed my eyes, transforming the outside world into a blizzard. I redirected my attention to the peculiar sound, recognizing its distinctiveness. It was man-made, almost mechanical, a stark contrast to the natural symphony one would anticipate in the wilderness. With a sense of curiosity, I quietly slipped out of bed. With great care to avoid disturbing Christina, I navigated across the room. Peering out the window, I was met with an unexpected sight: a snowmobile gliding slowly over the ice. While it's not unusual for people to ride snowmobiles on frozen lakes, the late hour left me puzzled. The snow was falling more heavily now, obscuring visibility, yet I could still discern the figure of the driver, who seemed to be proceeding with caution, as if uncertain about the ice beneath them. Then, without warning, they simply, completely halted. I observed as the individual dismounted and began flailing their arms as if in peril. It appeared they were shouting, yet the words eluded me. To my dismay, I recognized they were oriented towards our home. Did they have any inkling of our presence? It seemed unlikely. Regardless, their need for assistance was evident. I roused Christina to inform her of the unfolding situation, then dressed quickly, descended the stairs, and ventured outside onto the deck. The cold bit at me, even through my layers. As soon as I opened the door, I was met with another surprise. The figure on the ice was a woman, her voice piercing through the storm as she shouted for help, expressing her gratitude that someone had arrived. She was frantic, repeating that she had lost her little boy somewhere in the snowstorm, her tone teetering on the edge of tears and hysteria. There was no question in my mind about whether I would help. A child alone in that weather wouldn't survive for long. I quickly laced my boots and headed toward the lake, instructing Christina to stay put. As I drew nearer to the woman, I began to discern more details of her appearance. She was wrapped in a heavy fur coat, and her hair was neatly pulled back into a tight braid. The ice beneath us was completely solid, eliminating any fear of falling through. which allowed me to relax, realizing it would have been impossible for that little boy to have fallen through. As I approached, she began to explain that he had run away from home and that she was searching for him. Her words gave me pause, as I had anticipated a different response. It was something like he had fallen off her snowmobile without her noticing, and that thought spiraled into how absurd that whole scenario was. How could you not notice your own child falling off a snowmobile? The adrenaline must have been clouding my judgment, because it hadn't even crossed my mind until that moment. Just as I was about to ask her for more details, she said something that made me freeze. She asked if I still had those matches, and I could sense her smile. For a brief moment, I was completely at a loss. She was speaking, and suddenly everything fell into place. The matches, that package from the first day, the note she had left, not her host. Before I could respond, she reached into her coat and pulled out a gun. She demanded my wallet and phone, and I handed them over. I had no other option. The entire encounter unfolded in less than 30 seconds. Without another word, she climbed back onto the snowmobile and vanished into the whiteout. As she sped away, I turned toward the house and sprinted across the ice, shouting. While Christina was on the phone with the police, I finally returned to the house. I locked the doors and paced the room, still trembling. I kept glancing outside, half expecting to see that snowmobile return. The cops arrived about an hour later, but by then, the fresh snowfall had concealed any trace that woman had left. Christina was in a state of hysteria, but my predominant feeling was anger. I had come here seeking peace, yet there was a flicker of hope, though I couldn't fathom a dependable way that woman had. I had managed to get her snowmobile onto the lake, so I anticipated the police would at least discover the vehicle abandoned somewhere. Unfortunately, I was mistaken. The police scoured the area and stumbled upon an old boat ramp on the far side of the lake. Their best guess was that she had come from there. I was furious and insisted they continue searching, but they reiterated what I already knew. There wasn't much they could do. Even if she had left something behind, it would be nearly impossible to find it in all the snow. With Christina's assistance, I attempted to track my phone, but by that point, at that moment, it was already offline. The silver lining of the entire experience was that the Airbnb host refunded the entire trip. He seemed sincere during our phone conversation and assured me he was unaware of any welcome package. Yet, something about the situation felt off. How could that woman have known we would be staying there? And why would she go to such elaborate lengths for a simple robbery? I couldn't shake the feeling that the host might be involved, but I had no evidence. I raised my concerns with Airbnb, but they were as helpful as one might expect. It's true that I've always had a tendency to be a bit paranoid, but for a long time after that incident, I couldn't shake the feeling that my ex-wife was somehow involved. The thought of it still angers me as I write this. I can picture her laughing at my expense. I've tried to come to terms with how plausible that idea really is, yet the entire situation remains baffling. I still can't fathom why anyone would go to such lengths just for a wallet and phone, unless they were deeply troubled and derived some twisted enjoyment from it. My family owns a charming lake house in Northern California, a place we cherish visiting for a few short weeks each year during the peak of summer. It's a delightful two-story structure with an attic that holds fond memories. When my younger sister and I were little, we would sneak up to the attic, transforming it into our own little camping retreat with sleeping bags and our puppy by our side. There was a small window in the attic through which we would gaze down at the shimmering lake, finding joy in watching the people below. As we entered our teenage years, we found ourselves a bit too big to share that cozy space together. The attic was arranged in a way that put an end to our sleeping bag antics. Looking back, it was a bit sad, but everyone has to grow up eventually. When our grandparents passed away, my parents inherited the rest of their furniture. We had some room for the larger pieces, but the attic became crammed with the smaller hand-me-down items my parents couldn't bear to part with, as they were all that remained of my Nana and Pop. It felt bittersweet to store all of my grandparents' belongings up there, but it was necessary. It was comforting to realize that fragments of our most treasured belongings were still keeping an eye on us. That entire time truly felt like the conclusion of my childhood, and I'm sure my sister would concur. As we grew older, It became increasingly difficult for my family to visit the lake house due to my studies and my parents' jobs. At most, we could manage just 1 week off for a family getaway, but nothing more. My parents were hesitant to rent it out during the long months we were absent, as they were apprehensive. Concerns about their antiques being damaged or stolen by unreliable tenants led to the house being largely unoccupied for most of the year, maintained only by the landscapers my parents employed. However, a few years ago, they encountered a local elderly veteran who had transitioned into antique craft restoration. After some deliberation, they decided to sign a year-long lease with him, placing their trust in his ability to care for the property. He was a small, disfigured man with white hair and a gruff, greasy beard, and while we found his appearance somewhat unusual, his gravelly voice added to the impression. My dad connected with the man over their shared military experiences. He assured us that none of us could truly grasp the sacrifice of laying one's life down for the country, and that people like him deserved a fair deal on accommodations. We didn't really have a say in my dad's decision, but I can honestly say that this elderly man gives me the creeps. On top of that, we were all a bit upset about my dad signing the lease with him because it meant we wouldn't be able to visit the lake house. During the summer, my parents could really use the extra cash while supporting us through college, so my sister and I accepted the situation. Even though our parents had faith in him to manage the place without disaster, they would occasionally check in on him with a nudge from the landscapers. They needed to ensure he hadn't fallen or faced any unnoticed problems. These indirect check-ins felt like the ideal compromise. We kept our distance while still enjoying some peace of mind. You might consider it a bit intrusive, but given the circumstances, it was necessary. It seems like a good deal on the place, but I suppose an elderly, grumpy man in his later years wouldn't be too bothered by the occasional inquiries from relaxed landscapers. After all, he couldn't realistically maintain the lake house on his own. My dad figured that the rent at least took care of the upkeep, even if it appeared he had been a reasonable tenant. That perception changed when a maintenance crew alerted my mom about his concerning behavior during a phone call. They informed her that, while tending to the neighbors' yards, they frequently noticed him perched oddly on the porch, gazing at the children by the lake. They claimed to have witnessed him engaging in other unsettling behaviors that I prefer not to recount. My mother, a true saint, detested the thought of a disfigured old man watching over children while residing in her cherished lake house. For months, she vented to my father about it until he could endure no more. I can still recall her furious outbursts, insisting how reckless it was. As the year-long lease came to an end, my dad finally reached his breaking point with a potential troublemaker. He tried to let him down gently, holding a deep respect for him as a veteran. My dad fabricated a story about upcoming renovations that would leave the house without electricity or plumbing for a few months. The man departed without much of scene. The financial gain from him hadn't been significant, and my parents figured he would easily find another place. My mom reassured my dad, urging him to stop worrying. I had mixed feelings about him. My mom was eager to have him leave, so we even gave a landscaping crew a little extra to help him gather his things. Honestly, I was somewhat relieved to see him go. It always felt odd having someone so unusual around our home. About a year later, my younger sister graduated from college, and my parents took advantage of the occasion. They used their sick days and flew us out for a summer trip to the lake house, where they had recently welcomed a black lab into the family. There was a mixed-named bear that my sister hadn't met yet, and she was especially thrilled. I'll skip the irrelevant details, but by the time we finally arrived at the house, the sun had just begun to set. We decided to leave Bear inside while we went to grab dinner in town, since the house wasn't stocked with groceries or anything else. Before we left, I noticed Bear was acting strangely. His ears were perked up, and he kept pacing as if he was waiting for something. I assumed he just needed a rest after the long trip and brushed it off. We weren't gone long, just enough time to eat and let the heat die down. But when we stepped back inside, something felt off, like seriously off. Before I could say anything, I saw Bear. He was sprawled out at the foot of the stairs, panting hard. My sister screamed, and I realized there was blood smearing the floor beneath him. My mom immediately pulled out her phone, presumably to call 911. Without a word, my dad made his way into the kitchen and grabbed a knife. I followed suit, and the two of us slowly made our way around the house, searching. As we reached the top floor, my dad signaled for me to halt. It took a moment for me to grasp his intent, but then I noticed the attic hatch ajar, not fully open, just enough to reveal a dim beam of light flickering down. I can't say I felt brave. Fear gripped me tightly in that instant. Without my dad, I couldn't fathom what might have unfolded. Without a moment's pause, he pulled the hatch open and began climbing the ladder. I stayed behind this time, rooted in place. Filled with trepidation, I listened intently, anticipating the sounds of struggle, but silence enveloped the moment. Moments later, my dad descended the ladder, an air of calmness about him as he whispered that it was merely our former tenants. I could sense his internal conflict about how to proceed. Soon, my mom rushed up the stairs, and upon learning the situation, she erupted into a furious scream. My dad preferred to let the man leave, but my mom was resolute. She had already contacted the police. He appeared to be in dire condition. I could sense my father's deep sympathy. The police discovered our house key on him, which infuriated my mother, as my dad had assured her he had changed the locks. Fortunately, Bear survived, though he was gravely injured. Despite the man's terrible actions, my father chose not to press charges, regardless of what my mother or sister said to persuade him. This disagreement sparked one of the most significant arguments my parents ever had. I've always found it puzzling how my dad could feel such compassion for someone who had actually harmed his dog. This incident occurred about a year ago, and we haven't returned to the lake house since. It's difficult to admit, but this experience has significantly altered my childhood perception of that place. I can't say I'm eager to revisit it anytime soon. Last summer, when I was 20, my friend James, who hails from a very affluent family, his father is an IP lawyer working with the US government, was involved in this situation. I've acquired numerous properties scattered across the nation, along with a few international ones, embodying the wealth I'm referring to. One of these homes is situated by a sizable yet fairly secluded lake. While the lake isn't so expansive that the houses on the opposite shore are out of sight, swimming across it would certainly be quite the endeavor. James's parents were frequently absent, granting him almost unrestricted access to that house, and he often extended invitations to friends, naturally with permission. There's an undeniable sense of invincibility when you're out on the lake, a feeling that's distinct from a beach. It's hard to articulate, but there's a certain exclusivity to it. I hope to achieve enough success to afford a place there one day. The lake is quite secluded, surrounded by grand houses that often remain dark and unoccupied, as many are just vacation retreats for those who rarely visit. It's a bit of shame to think about, yet there are some silver linings to this situation. James often hosted the wildest gatherings there, free from the worry of neighbors dialing the police. However, this particular night was a departure from a norm. It was just the two of us enjoying a more laid-back evening. I won't delve into the details, but I had recently ended a 3-year relationship and was in desperate need of some time with a friend. We were sipping beers on the dock when I noticed a flickering light dancing across the lake. I can't recall the exact time, but at first, I thought it was merely the sun reflecting off something into my eye. Yet even when I tilted my head to the side, and there it was, flashing as if someone were flicking a light on and off in a rhythmic dance. I shared my observation with James, and together we became transfixed, attempting to decipher the mystery before us. Gradually, we recognized that the flashes were not haphazard. They adhered to a distinct pattern: 3 short bursts, followed by 3 longer ones, then 3 short again. Perhaps I was naive for not grasping it sooner, but when James snapped his fingers and declared it was Morse code, I regarded him with disbelief, questioning when he had ever learned such a thing. I learned about Morse code when he mentioned he didn't actually know it, but he recognized the pattern of 3 short and 3 long signals representing SOS. I called him out on it and pulled out my phone, only to find he was actually correct. Perhaps I'm foolish for not knowing that, but obscure knowledge isn't really my forte. The flashing persisted for another minute, maintaining that same rhythm before it suddenly ceased. We both just stared at it, unsure what to make of it. It could have been a prank, but there was always that possibility that someone was genuinely in distress. James quickly proposed we call the authorities, but I pointed out that we had been drinking and weren't of legal age yet. I was already grappling with a DUI charge, so the last thing I wanted was another encounter with law enforcement. He wasn't pleased with that response, and I could sense his internal conflict regarding the situation. Neither of us could come up with a reasonable explanation other than something drastic, like a kidnapping or something similar we speculated it could be. There was someone who had fallen and needed assistance, but it seemed odd since they could have easily called the police. We had always been the adventurous, rebellious type, so we figured it was worth investigating ourselves. If it turned out to be serious, we would call for help. We went back inside, where James's brother had a collection of switchblades scattered around his room. He was a bit of an oddball. We took a few for reassurance, and James insisted he was fine to drive. We decided to cruise around the lake instead. House. But I expressed my discomfort for clear reasons. He joked about my situation, and I brushed it off with laughter. If we weren't driving, there was really only one other option. We walked back to the yard and pulled James's dad's kayak into the water. Initially, we were laughing, reveling in the thrill of it all. But as we ventured further onto the lake, our laughter faded. I think we both recognized how foolish the idea was. Yet neither of us wanted to ruin the moment. The sun was nearly set. As we approached, the surroundings grew dimmer, though it wasn't completely dark. The glow from a few lake houses provided some reassurance. Still, an unsettling feeling crept in. The house emerged from the shadows, large like its neighbors, yet clearly neglected. The dock was a telling sign of its disrepair, half of it sunken into the water. The absence of flashing lights added to the ominous atmosphere. Our initial plan to tie the kayak to the dock was no longer feasible, given the circumstances. How unstable it appeared. But fortunately, the yard wasn't too elevated above the water, allowing us to beach the kayak there instead. We were cautious not to slip on the rocks, and I could feel the adrenaline beginning to surge. It was clear that James was experiencing the same rush. We glanced up at the house. The light was emanating from the second floor, and it was evident that James was starting to panic. He insisted we leave and call the police, but I reminded him that we would have to paddle all the way back to his house to do so, as there was no service on the lake. The need to connect to Wi-Fi lingered in the air. I reminded him of our countless adventures through abandoned buildings, asserting that this one wasn't much different. He wasn't convinced by that reasoning, but he conceded nonetheless. Trust me, I understand how foolish this seemed. Everyone I've confided in echoes that sentiment. Yet, I've never been known for making wise choices, and neither has James. We avoided the front door, an obvious risk, and instead, we stealthily navigated around the house until we discovered an unlocked window. Together, we slipped inside. The house was desolate, not merely forsaken, but devoid of life, as if everything had been stripped away. There was neither furniture nor clutter to be found in truth. There were no indications that anyone had ever resided there. The floors and walls stood stark and unadorned. We proceeded with caution through the rooms. In search of the stairs, not a soul was in sight. And each room mirrored the emptiness of the first. We eventually located the stairs and ascended with deliberate slowness. I had mentally marked the position of the window, and we carefully traversed one of the hallways until we reached what I surmised. The room from which the light had emanated stood before me. I pressed my ear against the door, straining to catch any sound. A glance at James confirmed his understanding. He nodded. With caution, I pushed the door open. Inside, the space was devoid of life, save for one object by the window. I crept toward it, my heart racing, and recognized it as an old projector aimed directly at the window. A surge of alarm coursed through me. This was a trap, meticulously orchestrated. James must have sensed the danger too, as I heard his footsteps pounding back the way we had come. Without a moment's hesitation, I turned and followed him as we raced down the stairs. The sound of a door, likely a closet, swinging open from the room I had just left reached my ears, accompanied by rapid thumping. We dashed through the house, heading back to that first window. James leaped through, and I was right behind him. As I climbed through, those footsteps echoed behind me, pounding down the stairs. I didn't dare look back. I simply made it through the window and sprinted to catch up. With James already at the lake's edge, I sprinted to catch up, only to hear him curse. It hit me then. The kayak was missing. I turned to see someone sprinting toward us from the side of the house. My mind struggled to grasp the scene. He was fast and large, definitely an adult. I drew my switchblade, prepared to defend myself, expecting James to do the same. Instead, he leaped straight into the lake, sneakers and hoodie and all. I didn't even think, I just reacted. Follow the water was freezing, but I didn't care. I swam as fast as I could, trying to fight the burning sensation in my arms and legs. We swam toward the light from James' house, which looked like a W. As miles away, the swim felt endless, but on pure adrenaline, we made it. By the time we dragged ourselves onto James' dock, I thought I had hypothermia. I don't think I've ever been that cold in my life. We ran straight inside, locked every door, and called the police. It took them almost an hour to show up. It was honestly kind of outrageous when they finally went straight across the lake to investigate. They were over there for a while, but when they returned, they told us exactly what I expected to hear, that there was no one there. They confirmed that this house had been abandoned for years. No signs of recent occupancy, no footprints, no gear, no personal belongings, nothing. Just an empty house. They weren't pleased with us and delivered the whole "why didn't you call?" speech. James's parents were even more upset when they found out. Let's just say I wasn't invited back. The lake house lingered in my mind long after James shared that his parents were contemplating legal action against the town for permitting such an incident and against the police for their lack of further inquiry. As for me, the events of that night remained shrouded in uncertainty. I can't fathom who occupied that house, the purpose behind the trap, or the intentions of those involved had we not escaped. Most of my friends are convinced it was indeed a trap, speculating that whoever orchestrated it hesitated at the final moment. The thought of what might have unfolded is one I prefer to avoid. What might have transpired had they proceeded with their intended course of action?